from the Digital Media Center on the campus of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This is Ramping Up Your English, an educational program for intermediate level English language learners. Here's your host for Ramping Up Your English, John Letts.
Welcome to Ramping Up Your English. Ramping Up Your English is for English language learners from all language backgrounds who have already begun the process of learning English as their second language. It's a program for people of all ages. If you're seeking greater English proficiency, this program is designed to help you reach that goal. Ramping Up Your English is a support program for English learners who have already passed the beginning stages of learning English. We take a content-based approach to helping you reach higher English proficiency. We use English to teach English. The theme of our first unit is Trains and Railroads. This is episode 32, and you're watching segment 1. This is also our last episode on the theme of trains and railroads. We'll move on to the science theme of animals next. Today, we'll take a look at excursion trains, like the skunk train we saw in our previous episode. Now, one of my favorite rail excursions was a train called Tren a las Nubes, and that's Spanish for train to the clouds, in the province of Salta, Argentina. Now, Argentina is the home of the tango, a well-known dance that sprung up to life in the streets of Buenos Aires. Now, Argentina has some natural wonders that will make your jaw drop, like Iguazu Falls, as you see right here. Argentina has its iconic fauna, the alpacas and the llamas. What it has few of is trains. Now, this is an old railroad station in Buenos Aires, and it wasn't very busy when I visited in 1995, and it's even less so now. People in Argentina travel by bus. Now, those buses give travelers some great views of the countryside. While Buenos Aires is a gigantic city, most of the country is rural. Now, there are some lonely stretches that go mile after mile, but a bus is a bus, and I wanted to take the train to the clouds. So while I used buses to get to Salta, I couldn't wait to get on the excursion train that would take me to places even more lonely. We followed this river in the dry season of winter, which is July down there in South America. Only a few braided channels carried water in this wide river. The word describes the best for this is desolate. That came to my mind as I gazed out the window. We're following this river into the Andes Mountains to the border with Chile. Now, you could look back and see the other part of the train, and you can also see how dry this country is this time of year. And talk about dry. Do you see anything green in this image? How about this image? You can see a trestle way off on the left side of the picture, but the landscape still remains pretty bleak at this point. And here we see a little bit more. We see a closer up look of a trestle, and this is one of the same rail line that we passed the trestle on later in the train. Here we see a little bit of green, but you notice that there's some animals out there, and you'll notice there's some white strips out there. That's salt, and a lot of this area is called salt. There's a word like sal, salinas. These are the salinas, because sal is the Spanish word for salt. We finally did find something other than just bare landscape, but not all that welcoming. This is a mine where they mine something, probably copper up in this area. We arrived at some civilization because these people came from over the mountains, and they had things to sell us on the train. In the next image, you'll see where they come right up to the train and would exchange the goods for the money right out the window of the train. I should mention that the train is not moving and that everyone moved away, safely away from the train when we went a little bit farther. Now here you see this bridge, this last trestle up there. If you want to sense a scale, look over to the left in the river part, the dry river. You'll see a car there to give you some idea of just how big this whole area is. And this is on that trestle looking down into that river. And here we see, looking down, if you look closely, you see the shadow of the trestle, but also the train. You can see a little gap between each of the cars of the train. And if you look carefully under that shadow, you see that car that we saw before, which gave us a sense of scale. And here I am standing on the trestle. And as you can see, I have a pretty heavy coat on. Now, out in the sunlight, it was pretty warm. We're up at a very high elevation, but it's almost like two different temperatures. Where the sun was shining on my face, I started getting a little warm in the coat. But on my other side, where it's in the shadow, I was actually still pretty cold. So there's very thin air up here. In fact, the air is so thin at this elevation that the train, which will stay on this image for a while, the train actually had doctors on it with bottles of oxygen. As we got higher and higher in elevation, more and more passengers were stopping by this bottle of oxygen, putting a mask on their face and getting a little extra hit of oxygen to make up for the thin atmosphere. Now, I was offered a bitter kind of leaf to chew on, and it didn't taste very good, but they say that it helps you absorb more oxygen from the air, and it must have been true because I didn't have to take any oxygen from there. Let's go on to the next image, and we will see that we have actually, the engine, the locomotive of the train has actually gone to the end of the train. That's what you're looking at now, and we all just turned our seats around to face the other direction. So now we have more to tell you about, and so I'm just waiting to tell you that from this part on, we were headed backward, in other words, back into Salta. And so, ready for some air with some higher oxygen content, I saw the train's engine attach itself to the rear, as I mentioned, of the train, and passengers all turned their seats around to face forward. It was a full and exciting day, and we ended our ride in the dark back in Salta. And while I chewed that leaf that was said to help with the thin air, as I said, I never had to take oxygen from the tank like several passengers. There was never a cloud in the sky that day, yet I can honestly say that I had ridden the Tren a las Nubes, the train to the stars. And not every train takes you where the oxygen is thin, but many go through scenery that will take your breath away. One of those is the Cumbres and Toltec Railroad in New Mexico and Colorado. We'll share some scenes from that trip later in this program. So we'll be right back right after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. If your English proficiency is nudging into the advanced level, you might be able to appreciate this high-quality book from National Geographic. It's entitled World's Great Train Journeys. As the title suggests, readers will learn about passenger trains in countries outside of the United States. One chapter I especially enjoyed was the one about the train through Mexico's Copper Canyon. I should warn you, though, reading this book might lengthen your bucket list. Reading is the most effective way to build vocabulary for intermediate language learners. Reading World's Great Train Journeys would be an exciting yet challenging experience for English learners. If nothing else, you'll enjoy the beautiful photographs. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is a program for intermediate learners of English. We take a content-based approach to raising your English proficiency to a higher level, doing so in a way that creates the least amount of stress. We use fun and interesting content to achieve that. You're watching our last program on the theme of trains and railroads. Now, one way to get your kicks on the rails is to ride an excursion railroad. These are also called tourist railroads, like the one I took in Argentina. There are many excursion railroads in the United States. This video clip features a few of them.
Today we learn about excursion trains, also called tourist trains. Excursion trains don't usually bring people to a destination. Riding the train is the destination. Local excursion trains like the Blue Goose in Wairika, California, offer a fun ride. I took my little brother to see if he liked the trains before taking him on our cross-country trip. Some excursion trains are better than others. The Cumbres and Toltec Railroad travels over part of the historic narrow-gauge line of the Rio Grande Railroad, from Chama, New Mexico to Antonito, Colorado, in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. Like many excursion railroads, the Cumbres and Toltec uses steam engines, also called locomotives, to pull the train. In the United States, the driver of the train is called the engineer. He works with the firemen to operate the locomotive. Steam engines require a lot of water. Here the engine takes on water from an elevated tank or water tower. Once we were loaded with water, fuel, and passengers, our train took us to this scenic countryside. At times, the train crew had to stop and pour water on fires, set accidentally by sparks from the train. This was definitely a mountain railroad with high bridges called trestles and tunnels. This is one of the tunnels, what they look like inside. It gets very dark in the long tunnels. In English, we have a saying, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning that things are going to get better. Steam engines produce smoke when pulling uphill. At stops, we were able to look over the giant metal wheels and pistons on the steam engine. Excursion trains delight rail fans, as well as people seeking beautiful scenery. And when it comes to scenery, you can hardly beat the White Pass and Yukon route in Alaska. We arrived at the Yukon station after taking a bus from the historic gold town of Skagway. This was a classic tourist train ride. We left Skagway to board the train and ride it back to Skagway. We began following the Yukon River, soon crossing the border back into the United States. The fog and mist gave this country a magical feel, as if riding a railroad through the clouds.
And folks, at this point, the tickets have been collected, so if you'd like to step
Through the fog, we saw this old railroad trestle. It's like we were seeing the ghost of a historic railroad. What was really spooky is as we followed this railroad with our eyes, we could see that it just ended abruptly. We'd see no trains on this trestle. The White Pass Railroad was built about 1900, only 2 years after the gold rush here. Before the railroad, gold miners trudged up this steep pass on foot. Some were then turned back by Canadian mounted police if they lacked sufficient supplies to live and work in this isolated region. From Skagway, Alaska, the miners set out in the deep snow to find and mine the claims up the river. When the railroad was built, they could cover the same distance that once took them several weeks in a matter of hours. But then they had to go further from there to stake their claims. Even from a distance, we could see the tracks crossing this tumbling creek on a bridge. When water crashes on rocks like this, it's forced to carry more oxygen, making it look white. We eventually descended to the level of the river. The clean water looks slightly milky. That's because it carries silt from upstream glaciers as they melt. That substance is called glacial flour, kind of like the flour people use to bake with. We're no longer following the Yukon River. This is the Skagway River. It flows to Skagway, Alaska. So does the railroad.
Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 2 of episode 32. Excursion trains are pulled by a variety of locomotives, but the most popular ones are pulled by steam engines, like the one in the previous video clip. Watching video of steam locomotives presents an excellent chance to delve into science inquiry. Along with the smoke from the stack, you can always see steam hissing through parts of the engine and powering the whistle that makes trains such beloved machines in the United States. We'll look into the science of steam when we return.
What's a horse doing on Ramping Up Your English? We're galloping toward a new unit, animals. So we're in the country meeting some horses. Horses are just one of the many animals that will help viewers ramp up their English.
So funny. Our Mr. Cowboy, you loving that?
Horses, boy, I'm getting the flies. You see, horses have to deal with flies. Coming soon to RVTV Voices, a new unit on Ramping Up Your English, an educational support program for intermediate level English learners from all language backgrounds. So how can horses help you improve your English? Watch Ramping Up Your English to find out on channels 15 and 115 in Ashland and channel 182 on Charter Cable in Southern Oregon.
A simple pot of boiling water can help you learn and teach about the science of steam. Now, any activity involving this level of heat needs to be supervised by an attentive adult. Steam and boiling water can do major damage, so be sure to be safe with this activity. It's intriguing to watch water boiling, and it brings out all kinds of questions. What makes the bubbles? Where does the steam come from? Why is the inside of the lid coated with water? All these questions are great starting points for science inquiry. With this simple demonstration, you can observe the water cycle. Here, you can see the evaporation. There's condensation on the lid, which is cooler than the hot water. And if you take the lid off, the water will precipitate down to the surface. It will even collect if you let enough of it fall, like this. Now, you may also want to evaporate a small amount of water on a warm surface, showing that water vapor, the water that evaporates, is not always visible, like it is here. Okay, so we're going to take a look now at this diagram of the water cycle. That steam we just saw is evaporation, so find that word on the cycle. The beating up on the lid, you remember the lid was a little bit cooler? That's condensation. And when it dripped off the lid, that's precipitation. Now, you can also explore distilling. Try mixing salt in the water you boil and see if the salt precipitates out. In other words, if it's in those drops that precipitate. You can explain that this is why certain equipment requires distilled water, so that impurities don't build up and clog openings on the equipment. Now, if you don't mind making a mess, you can even let a pot of oatmeal boil over to demonstrate the power of water that's changed from a liquid into a gas. I'm not going to do that today. Now, water has some qualities that makes biological life possible on Earth. The fact that it expands and thus floats when it cools into a solid state creates the climatic conditions from which life could emerge in our oceans. It also expands, as many other things do, when it's heated. Have an object float in room temperature water and see what happens when you add a drop of dishwashing soap. That's another thing you could do to see the properties of water. So from trains to steam engines to the characteristics of water, this unit offers many opportunities to integrate science into the unit. Instead of water, you could study friction. Now, friction has everything to do with the success of railroads. Rubbing your hands together briskly readily demonstrates that friction produces heat. Now, trains are so much more fuel efficient than trucks, largely because there's less friction with metal wheels on metal rails than rubber tires on concrete. That's also a reason why freight trains may require a mile or more to stop when braking. It's also why steam engines often carry sand to gain enough traction on the rails to begin moving. Now, those who want to get deep into science and engineering can even study metallurgy. Like science inquiry itself, the possibilities are endless. And we'll be back with more of Ramping Up Your English after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. Are you looking for outstanding photography and a way to strengthen your English vocabulary? You'll have both in Seymour Simon's Book of Trains from HarperCollins Publishers. Each time you turn a page in this book, you're treated to world-class photography. One page features a train switching yard in Portland, Oregon. Most pages have written information about the picture you're enjoying and about trains in general. You'll encounter the precise vocabulary of train terminology. You'll also encounter language forms like present tense verbs and prepositional phrases. You'll see how objects are used to describe things by listing their parts. Mostly, though, you'll enjoy learning more about trains and about the various cars on the train. You're also likely to find the reading level understandable. Seymour Simon's Book of Trains is a beautiful book that offers an enjoyable way to learn more about trains. You'll have to get your own copy. I'm too attached to mine. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 3 of episode 32. We're using a content-based approach to help people who want their English to improve. If that's you, you're in the right place. Whether you're enjoying this program on the Ashland Home Network, Charter Cable, or watching it after going to our archives as video on demand, if you're viewing this program from a TV station outside of the Southern Oregon area, that's fine too. I'd like to welcome you to the program. I'd love to hear from you. You can contact me through my website, letscreate.org. You may have heard me say in earlier episodes that English is a crazy language. Well, it can sure seem that way when you're trying to learn it. Here are a few examples of what I mean. We watched a live program about people who live in Spain. Now, you should be seeing that on your screen, okay? Or how about this one? The bandage was wound tight around the wound. Then there's the farm that's used to produce produce. Or how about the trains consist of boxcars and flat cars. The dump was so full it had to refuse more refuse. Or how about it was time to present the present to her friend. The dove dove into the bushes. Or I don't object to the object being placed here. Now, these are all examples of words that are spelled exactly alike, but pronounced differently depending on how they're used. They have very different meanings. You know, I once worked with a volunteer in my classroom who was from Spain, and one day she asked me how to spell live, L-I-V-E, I replied. Then, how do you spell live, she asked. Well, I answered L-I-V-E, just like live. She looked at me like I was making up something to confuse her. Native English speakers learn early when the teacher spells read and read the same way. Now, here are a few more examples. They were too close to close the door. The wind was too strong to wind the sail. I had to subject the subject to more tests. Well, then there are words that sound alike but are spelled differently, and they too have distinct meanings. I heard the herd of buffalo before I saw it. How about I never read Mao's little red book, or we rode the horse on the road. The runner's feet helped her accomplish a great feat. He led the team that found lead in the water. Now, you may not know enough English at this point to understand all these words. Try not to be overwhelmed by the idiosyncrasies of English. Sometimes it's just fun to play around with the language, as we're doing here. Moving from the beginning steps to higher levels of English is a huge overtaking. But if you enjoy each of those steps, then you'll have more fun with it, and you'll arrive at the same higher level as those who don't have fun with it. Being serious about improving English means engaging with instruction and practice, but it doesn't have to be a miserable experience. Now, I hope you've enjoyed these 32 episodes. If that's the case, I'm very happy about it on the theme of trains and railroads. I hope to take many more trips in the future on trains, and if you love these videos, check out my website for new bonus videos in the future. My website, letscreate.org. You'll find episodes of Ramping Up Your English there, as well as the language lessons and practice sets. You can also contact me through that website, and I'd love to hear how it's going for you in learning to improve your English through this program. Just click the Contact Us button. The website again is letscreate.org. You can watch all the episodes of Ramping Up Your English and even download them as video on demand by visiting archive.org/details/RogueTV. There's a sidebar on the right of the screen. Find the Ramping Up Your English or my name, John Letts. Click there, get right onto the programs that you want. Now, we're changing themes now, but we're not going away. You can still watch Ramping Up Your English with our new theme of animals at 8 a.m. on Mondays and 7 p.m. on Thursdays. You can watch on channels 15 and 115 on the Ashland Home Network or on channel 182 on Charter Cable in Southern Oregon. Now, channels and schedules will vary in other areas of the country. Contact your local public access station for times, days, and channels. Ramping Up Your English would not be possible without RVTV and its supporters. The staff at RVTV has been vital in the programming and scheduling of the program, and they've been both helpful and encouraging. Now, even with all that support, this program would not be possible without the help of my crew. There are a great number of things that have to happen here for the program to exist, and my volunteer crew give up their time, effort, and talents to make it all happen. So I want to thank them. And I also want to thank you, our viewers. Without you, there's no reason for this program to exist. Now, you won't have to wait long before the next episode. Keep watching for the next episode of Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/RogueTV. Join us next time on RBTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.
Okay, I'm stepping into Michael's time a little bit here, so I'm going to try to get this set torn down. Oh, they do? Oh, okay. Okay, that's great.